Good evening, everyone. I'm Shivani Gupta. Over 100 people have been killed in twin suicide attacks in Kabul last evening. 13 US service members, including 10 Marines, and as many as 95 Afghans have been killed, with scores more injured. The blast took place at Abbey Gate of the Hamid Karzai Kabul airport and at Baron Hotel a few kilometers away, even as thousands were gathered in a desperate effort to flee after the Taliban's takeover of the country. The attack marked the deadliest day for the US military in Afghanistan since 2011 and came just 5 days before the Biden administration's deadline for the complete military withdrawal from the country. The US expects many such more attacks. For the world, of course, this is a grim reminder of how the country of Afghanistan and the very region, including India, has been plunged into utter chaos and darkness with a rather ill-planned and ill-executed withdrawal of the US forces that left the Taliban in charge and legitimized, and as many as 20 other hardcore Islamist terror groups re-energized. One of these deadly groups is the ISIS, the Islamic State terror group, more specifically the ISIS Khorasan, that claimed responsibility for the, quote, Fidayeen attacks. And it's quite a nightmare how they managed to get through scores of checkpoints manned by the Taliban, whom they oppose, and get so close to the forces at the airport gate that they managed to inflict the third deadliest attack on US forces ever in Afghanistan. This is the statement that they released after the attack, that their suicide bomber managed to reach a large gathering of translators and collaborators with the American army near Kabul airport and detonated his explosive belt, killing about 60 people and wounding more than 100 others, including Taliban fighters. Of course, the death toll now is well over 100. So who exactly is the ISIS-K? They're really made up of former Pak Afghan Taliban members. They are a regional affiliate of the ISIS, of course, formed in January 2015. The group base is out of Nangarhar. They are the most extreme and violent jihadist group in Afghanistan. Their first attack on April 18 in 2015 was in Jalalabad. They are notorious for targeting girls' schools and even maternity wards. UN estimates around 2,200 ISK fighters in East and North Afghanistan. They have strong ties with the Haqqani network and the Taliban in turn. So really, they're all connected. Now, US President Joe Biden has vowed revenge, that perpetrators will be hounded and killed. You know what that means? It means if he actually stays true to his words, the US will stay invested in the region with the help of Pakistan. So they're basically being sucked into this quagmire again, which only and only works for Pakistan, the terror factory of the world.
To those who carried out this attack, as well as anyone who wishes America harm, know this: we will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay. I bear responsibility for fundamentally all that's happened of late.
A few days ago, you said you squarely stand by your decision to pull out.
Yes, I do.
Now, what happened in Kabul yesterday is also due to the turf war between the Taliban and the ISKP. Let's break that down for you. Both are, of course, hardline terror groups, but they oppose each other. The ISKP accuses the Taliban of abandoning jihad, quote-unquote. The Taliban, mind you, is moderate for them. The hostility also arises from other ideological differences. Talibs who oppose the talks with the US joined the ISKP, and the ISKP is also recruiting disenfranchised Taliban members. And the situation is absolutely nightmarish for everyone concerned. Nobody really knows who's in control in Afghanistan. Can the Taliban that seeks legitimacy really have control over other terror groups, many of which differ in their goals? Jim Banks, Republican congressman, painted a grim picture of what the days ahead could be like, because this Taliban has control over billions of dollars worth US military equipment now.
My job there was as a foreign military sales officer, so I was on the front lines of acquiring the equipment that the Americans provided and turned over to the Afghan army and the Afghan police. I'm going to read to you what is so painful for me and so many other Afghan veterans who served in that capacity and others who served as a part of the train, advise, and assist, equip effort in helping the Afghans. We now know that due to the negligence of this administration, the Taliban now has access to over $85 billion worth of American military equipment. That includes 75,000 vehicles, over 200 airplanes and helicopters, over 600,000 small arms and light weapons. The Taliban now has more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of the countries in the world. But they don't just have weapons. They also have night vision goggles, body armor, medical supplies, and unfathomable to me and so many others is that the Taliban now has biometric devices, which have the fingerprints, eye scans, and the biographical information of the Afghans who helped us over the last 20 years. And here's what we just learned again in the briefing that we just walked out of, is this administration still has no plan to get this military equipment or these supplies back.
So as the world watches in horror, we ask today, with this resurgence of Islamic terror with a base in Afghanistan, how will the world respond? Major General Rajesh Arya, former Chief of Staff 15 Corps, is joining us on the show. Also with us, our special guest today, Major Andrew Fox, a British Army major who served on 3 tours in Afghanistan. Kabir Taneja, Fellow, Strategic Studies, ORF, and Professor Scott Lucas, International Affairs Expert, Emeritus Professor of International Politics, University of Birmingham, also joining us. I want to go across to Major Andrew Fox first. You know, you've been quite distressed with the way the US pullout has happened. It has obviously left not just billions of dollars worth of equipment and military equipment in the hands of the Taliban. We are seeing the chaos that is now prevailing. Do you see worse days ahead, especially with the way that this pullout was executed and what we've just witnessed in Kabul last evening?
Hello there. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate your invitation. So the most heartbreaking thing for me is that the Americans have pulled out so fast and they haven't given the Afghans a real chance to succeed. I appreciate that the Afghanistan campaign was always going to come to an end at some point. I don't think anyone disputes that. Mm-hmm. But to simply drop everything and run left our allies in Afghanistan with absolutely no chance. And so America, the way they've handled this has been, I think, has been negligent, and I think it has been shameful.
We're, of course, wondering what's going to happen in Afghanistan vis-a-vis all the terror groups rearing their ugly head again. This could be worse than what the world has ever seen.
As you identify, they've got a huge amount of equipment now. I don't know whether they'll be able to sustain it. The Afghan army couldn't. Whether the Taliban will be able to, I think is up for discussion. But they have now the option to sell it. They have the option to sell it to non-state actors. And so there's a huge opportunity here for any terrorist group that wants to get their hands on any top-grade military kit, to go to the Taliban and purchase it from them. And I've spoken to people in Kabul this morning. I spoke to one lady who lost 3 of her cousins in the bombing yesterday. And so your ordinary Afghans are also going to be in a state of terror for the foreseeable future.
Do you expect that there would be any response from the global community? Knowing that the ISIS is rearing its ugly head and there are, multiple more all shades of terror Islamic groups in Afghanistan. I mean, you served 3 tours in Afghanistan. What is your reading of what could happen?
It all depends on how much the international community is able to influence the Taliban. When they were in power before, they were quite insular. They had connections with Pakistan, but they weren't really friends with much of the rest of the world. And so our Prime Minister has said he's going to try and use every lever, so be that financial, be that economic, be that diplomatic, to try and influence the way the Taliban do business. But how realistic that is depends very much on how the Taliban decide to approach international affairs and whether they are receptive to influence from the West.
Right, but Major Fox, do you really believe the Taliban could be in control, even if they tried their best?
Well, my understanding is that the Taliban is not one organization. They're a very disparate group of people. You have the central control, and then you have a network of warlords and local tribal leaders who are affiliated to the Taliban because it suits the way they do business at the moment. And they've seen an opportunity here to exert their control through the Taliban rather than through the Kabul government that was in place before. And so how much influence they have over those tribal warlords and leaders, that's very, very varying between regions. And as you've identified, the fact that Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, they're all operative within Afghanistan. That's going to make it extremely difficult for them to keep any control, and I suspect their control is going to be quite tenuous for the next few months at least.
Right. I want to go across to Kabir Taneja also, who's looked at the ISIS and its working and functionings very closely. Kabir, just paint a picture for us. What is this horrifying cocktail of 20 plus terror Islamist groups that we're looking at now in Afghanistan, rearing their ugly head? We've already seen what ISIS is capable of. Could this be worse than what the world has ever seen?
It is grim, right? We have to look at from beyond just a level of whether it's an American perspective or a NATO perspective. From a South Asian perspective, it is not very good news at the moment. Considering what Afghanistan can become if it is not under some sort of regulation and government system. And we still have to wait and see what the Taliban are able to achieve on that front. I'm just seeing now that the death toll of the attack that was committed by ISKP in Kabul yesterday is over 150. This is now, I think, the second biggest attack in South Asia after Sri Lanka. Both have been done in the name, at least, of the Islamic State. So the threat is quite significant from a South Asian perspective, and we have to remember that when we are talking about Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, we are talking about ISKP in Afghanistan and the other groups in Afghanistan. The immediate threat perception is for the region, is for South Asia. It is fully plausible that Al-Qaeda is diminished enough today that it is not able to attack mainland Europe or mainland US in the near future or even in the far future. But what about the factions? What about Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent? It was one of the first organizations to congratulate the Taliban when it marched into Kabul. So we have to see it from what perspective we are seeing that these groups are going to be operating in. And South Asia is definitely right at the border of these threats.
Yeah, basically the threat is the greatest for India, isn't it, as far as democracies in this region go. I want to go across to General Arya also. General Arya, the way that things have happened in Afghanistan and even US was surprised, it has turned out to be a great humiliation for the US. And with it really, you could say Western powers, so as to speak. Don't you feel that this is going to re-energize all of these jihadist movements and terror groups? And Afghanistan could well become the base for all of them, because this is, both psychologically and otherwise on ground too, a great humiliation for the West.
Good evening, Shivani. Thank you for having me on your show. First of all, at the cost of repeating, I must say that I just heard ex-President Trump's speech, and I'll pick up from that it is one of the most ill-conceived and ill-executed political and military retreat or a withdrawal in the recent military history. Yes, withdrawal of US was on the cards. It was in the offing. It had been planned. It had been worked out. It was being worked out. But the way it has been actually conceived as a operation and executed, it is one of the worst humiliating withdrawal of an international power. And there's no doubt about it. You have to hear just few experts. Whether it was a disconnect between the political hierarchy and the military hierarchy of the US troops or the allied forces, whether they miscalculated the negotiating partner Taliban who was to take over, whether they miscalculated the then regime of the Afghanistan, that is a history now. But what we are going to see is what Taneja said or what Mark said is going to be one of the worst nightmare in the world of Islamic international jihadism. And right in the neighborhood of India, rightfully we are most concerned about it, because definitely it was one of the deadliest attacks in the last 10 years over the US troops. The people in the line of fire are those innocent Afghanis who are neither aligned with Taliban, nor aligned with ISIS, nor aligned with the Western forces, but they are the sufferers. You have hundreds and thousands of people in utter chaos trying to flee Pakistan all around Afghanistan borders, whether it is the east, west, north, or through the allied forces by air to the western countries. So we are going to see a utter chaos in the Southeast Asia. India on the neighborhood of this, just having a Pakistan, which has been a failed state, which have been a hotbed of the terrorism, and Pakistan itself does not have a control of any terror organization operating from his soil. It is going to be a nightmare for India.
No, but I just come back to my question. Do you see a revival of these Islamist movements? You know, recruitment is going to be so easy for them. And the ISIS anyways operates in lone wolf attacks. Europe has seen that. In India, we've seen ISIS recruitment happening.
We have given on platter. We have given on platter an ungoverned, unorganized a piece of ground in huge areas in Afghanistan to reorganize, reconfigure, and train themselves as an international jihadi movement to the international Islamic fundamentalist organization. Not only the current 20 organization or 30 organization, you will see so many disgruntled fundamentalist organization like we saw in the 90s from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and all other, going to get the breeding ground, and it's going to be trouble for international community.
Let me go across to Professor Scott Lucas also. Could we see a worse cycle of Islamic terror then in the world than ever before? And how is the global community going to respond to this?
Well, I think we can all agree that the withdrawal was disastrous, first and foremost for Afghans. But we have to establish where we are now, I think. And there are two important dimensions when you deal with this question of the Taliban and other groups. First, inside Afghanistan, it is not viable to try to overthrow the Taliban as in 2001. Mr. Saleh and Mr. Massoud's group in the Pashtun Valley does not have the strength of the Northern Alliance back then. And the Americans don't have the capabilities that they had back then after their withdrawal. So do you isolate the Taliban, which means that you have an isolated Taliban in a country with all these different groups who are operating, or do you engage with the Taliban, in part because you engage with them as you try to push back ISIS-K, which is a rival of the Taliban, which is opposed to the Taliban. In other words, is the enemy of my enemy, if not necessarily my friend, but a necessary partner. So that question of how you approach the Taliban is there for all countries, including India. Secondly, there's the regional dimension. It is not possible, and I've heard many Indian voices, and I respect these voices, who say, well, we need to sanction Pakistan. But you will not isolate Pakistan this time. Pakistan is a broker in the region, and it is allied with China, a position it did not have in 2001. So if you cannot isolate Pakistan, how do you engage with Pakistan to try to get it to be effective in trying to contain the Taliban and not enabling it? And when you ask that question of how you engage with Pakistan, you're also asking how you engage with other countries who are trying to get a role in Afghanistan, such as the Chinese and such as the Russians, and indeed, even closer, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan.
Right.
So what is your regional strategy here beyond just simply saying Islamist terrorism?
I want to go across to Andrew Fox once again. As a soldier, you know, we've heard some voices from the US Army also that, you know, these forces that they were fighting in Afghanistan, they couldn't do much because they would just run off to Pakistan and they could attack on Pakistan. As a soldier, I'm wondering what you feel about, you know, allying with the same forces, in this case Pakistan, that is feeding the same enemies that you're fighting. I mean, for us here in India, this is a forever war that is never going to end, and forces like the US and NATO are never going to succeed in their basic aim of eliminating terror, which they started out with, unless they rethink their strategy on Pakistan.
The Pakistani question has been phenomenally challenging because there are clearly different factions within Pakistan itself. You know, there is the government with whom we can do deals, but, you know, I noticed that Mr. Khan's speech the other day was pretty unhelpful. And you have then things like the ISI, the security services, who are very much playing their own game in regards to Afghanistan, and we knew full well, each winter the Taliban would go back to Pakistan, rearm, retrain, and then come and fight us again the next summer. So Pakistan's been an ongoing problem for Afghanistan. But as the professor said, you have to decide whether you're going to isolate them or whether you're going to accept real politics and you're going to try and engage with them to get a result that you want. So whilst, on a very personal level, I'm quite resentful towards Pakistan for the way that they've behaved over the last 20 years. They've got their strategic goals, and as a professional, I understand that. And so with that professional head on and that rational thinking, I appreciate we need to try and engage with Pakistan, or there is no solution to this problem.
All right. Be that as it may, the reality that it is, realpolitik. Kabir, I have just 30 seconds left. What does India need to do then? Because the threat for India is very real and present.
India needs to wait and watch right now, of course, but also side by side shore up its defenses on certain sectors that are more vulnerable to these kind of events. That is predominantly, of course, in Kashmir. And we've heard the Chief of Defence Staff recently also saying that they have been monitoring the situation and have been acting in accordance to what is required to be done. Beyond the point, at the moment at least, it's not in India's hands. It doesn't seem in anyone else's hands at the moment anyway. So it's the best thing to do at the moment from an Indian perspective is wait and watch and strategically react when as and when required.
Right. So it's a wait and watch for most countries. But India, of course, needs to be very, very wary of what's really transpiring in Afghanistan. We don't really know exactly. It may not be immediate, but 1 year, 2 year, 5 year down the line, what are all of these groups really going to be up to? The world needs to really think about that. Thanks a lot to all of our guests for joining. And even as I end this show, we're getting news as it's running on the bottom of your screens that the death toll from the Kabul attack has reached 170 now. Thanks a lot for watching.